Welcome back. We're talking about the upcoming summit between the Chinese and American presidents in Florida. Joining us now from Beijing, Victor Gao is a Chinese international relations expert. And with me in the studio, Brendan Mulvaney is director of the China Aerospace Studies Institute. Thanks to both of you for joining us. Victor, let me start with you. And let's talk about the DPRK's missile and nuclear program and whether there could be a resolution to that in the near future. The U.S. position is that China needs to act to rein in that program that has been conducted by the DPRK. The Chinese Foreign Minister, Wang Yi, as we heard from our reporter, has put out a proposal, the so-called double suspension proposal, that the DPRK suspend its tests, and in return, the United States and South Korea, the ROK, will stop joint exercises. Now, that has been rejected by the United States. So what's the way forward?
Well, first of all, please allow us to congratulate the upcoming summit meeting between Chinese President Xi Jinping and the U.S. President Donald Trump in Florida. This will be a landmark summit meeting, and we hope all the best will come out of that. And while we still keep our realism in terms of our expectation for the summit meeting, the Korean issue will definitely figure very prominently in the summit meeting, and different parties have already put forward their different ideas or proposals. And right now, I think the situation is very tense, especially because of the launch of another missile by DPRK just on the eve of the summit meeting. Now, China's position is clear. China does not want to see the nuclear program and the launch vehicle program by DPRK. China has applied all the pressure possible to try to bring a discontinuation of the nuclear program. It doesn't sound right when Donald Trump says that China is not being helpful. China is being helpful as much as it can. On the other hand, I don't think, doing a unilateral action militarily by the United States against DPRK at this very tense moment will be constructive. Therefore, I think China most likely will make its case that its diplomacy and continued dialogue will be better than any unilateral action of military actions against the DPRK. And we really need to close rank and incentivize each other and try to put more pressure on DPRK so eventually we can achieve the denuclearization goal on the Korean Peninsula.
Brendan, I want to get your view on this, but first, let's listen to what the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman had to say about this particular issue. Let's watch.
China has been making great efforts and played an important role in trying to resolve the issue on the Korean Peninsula. But both the symptoms and root causes need to be addressed by balancing the reasonable concerns of all parties. China would like to make concerted efforts together with all parties to realize denuclearization of the peninsula and lasting peace and security in the region.
So China says, we're doing all we can. The United States says, you're not doing enough. You need to do more. What's the way out?
Well, I think both sides are partially right. China has been doing a lot more than they had been in the past, and I think we should congratulate China and thank them for their efforts in this. Over the last several years, China and North Korea have had a more and more contentious relationship, and I think the Chinese have come to realize that this is not in their strategic interest and have adopted things that are, in the American view, very positive. That said, there's still more they could do. There's still more the United States could do. And hopefully, when they discuss this, the two presidents will be able to come to some sort of, if not mutual agreement, but an understanding of each side, how far they could go and what are some of the ways through this situation.
Do you think they would be able to find some common ground at the summit?
Probably not at this summit. I think it's too early in the Trump administration. I think it's a very contentious issue with the missile launch just yesterday, kind of thumbing the nose at the international community and President Xi for his visit. So I think this summit, it's probably too early, but they can discuss some broad outlines and maybe lay the groundwork for some future dialogue.
Victor, moving on to the South China Sea, we just heard Ambassador Locke there explain the U.S. position on the South China Sea. He said during that interview that he hoped there'd be a diplomatic way out of this. What does a diplomatic solution look like?
Well, first of all, it is indeed true that there are territorial disputes in the South China Sea. China has such disputes with countries like the Philippines. There is no denying of that. The key issue is how to deal with this and apply more pressure unilaterally try to create a confrontation involving China and other countries is definitely the wrong way to deal with these territorial issues. If you look at the world, there are many areas where territorial disputes exist, and it's always wise for countries like the United States not to pick sides in any such territorial disputes. It's better for countries like China and the Philippines to really engage in diplomacy and dialogue and negotiation, try to seek a peaceful solution of such territorial disputes. Meantime, before such territorial disputes are resolved, it's better for China and the Philippines and other countries to really devote themselves to peaceful cooperation, economic cooperation, so that people of the various countries can benefit from the overall environment of peace, goodwill, friendship, and economic development. That's the better way to deal with the territorial disputes in the South China Sea.
Brendan, is there potential for confrontation here?
Certainly there's potential. I think it's probably more likely going to come from a miscalculation, some sort of miscue going on that the people on the ground don't really understand what's the significance of their action. But I think strategically, neither side wants any kind of confrontation. Right. The U.S. has repeatedly stressed that it wants a peaceful and mutually acceptable resolution to this problem. And we don't really have a stake in how it gets resolved at the end. We just want it to be mutually beneficial to all sides and to be accepted by them.
Well, let's take a step back here. What is at stake here? Is it a case of sovereignty, of territorial integrity, of freedom of navigation? What is being disputed here?
Well, all of it is definitely included. I think just the sovereignty is disputed. The United States has a very clear policy that we don't take any sides on the sovereignty of any of these. Well, now we know none of them are islands. They're all just features after the arbitrational ruling. But we don't take any position on sovereignty. We don't really care how it gets resolved at the end, as long as it's peacefully and mutually understanding. However, freedom of seas, freedom of navigation, freedom of overflight, all these things are core U.S. interests, and we're going to continue to pursue them to make sure that these seas and this very busy waterway is open to all, including the Chinese, who have a very big stake in making sure that it's peaceful and stable and free, just as much as the United States does. So I think there's opportunities for us to work together on those common interests, despite some of the possibilities for conflict.
All right, Victor, let's talk trade. Trade between these two countries worth $700 billion. Yet there's been tough talk from Donald Trump during the election campaign, as well as after he became president, accusing China of not being fair, of being a currency manipulator. Another big issue for these two countries, the trade deficit between China and the United States. How will China and the U.S. move forward on this?
Well, first of all, China-U.S. trade reaching $600 billion is the largest trade volume between any two countries in the world. There are problems. China does have a huge trade surplus. The United States does have a huge trade deficit, and the challenge is how to deal with that. If you adopt the zero-sum game theory to look at the bilateral trade, then you can get at each other's throat and try to tear each other apart and launch a trade war, which will be destructive of both countries. If you are wise enough, you are visionary, if you really have the courage and the wisdom to deal with that, then let's propose that China-US increase their bilateral trade to about $1 trillion. That means another $400 billion can be added onto that. And in the new additional volume added to the China-US trade, the United States can sell more goods and services to the United States. In China, there is a huge demand, a huge appetite for many goods and services produced by the United States. Therefore, I don't think it's time to be desperate. I think it's time for greater courage and wisdom, and it's also dependent on the side of the United States as to how they can come up with more goods and services to sell to China. The United States and President Donald Trump have been calling for U.S. energy independence a lot. Eventually, the United States may have huge amount of oil and gas to be exported. As a matter of fact, the first shipment of LNG out of the United States eventually ended up in China. Therefore, we need to be very bullish about that. We need to be optimistic about that. And the two leaders could really engage with each other in an amicable way to try to find out a better solution to the bilateral trade issue. The more trade between the two countries actually should be better for both countries.
Brendan, one other this is a security issue, and during the Obama years, there was a lot of talk about the pivot to Asia, rebalancing. What is the status of that now?
Well, so very clearly, the pivot has ended. Acting Secretary of State for East Asia said We're no longer using those terms. We're no longer doing that. That doesn't mean that our interest in Asia is dead, however. I think the U.S. military, the U.S. Diplomatic Corps, and economics is all very closely tied to Asia, and we're going to continue to move more and more assets and interest into the region. So I wouldn't characterize it as a pivot anymore, but certainly we have some long-term interests, friends, allies, partners, and opportunities there. So we're going to be engaged there for a long time to come.
You know, we've talked a lot about the differences between China and the U.S. on security issues, Brendan, but there must be security concerns where these two countries can work very quickly together, like the fight against terrorism.
Sure, and we have a long history of the two countries of working together on mutual interests like that. Against terrorism, against international crime, all these things are certainly good opportunities, and that we have a basis to work from. So I think that would be a positive on the security aspect. Certainly we want a stable international global order. It's good for their economy, it's good for our economy, it's good for everybody's security. So on these things, certainly from a base level we can work up.